So running. Hi everyone. Welcome to another session of Ask the Expert. Today we're talking about a new feature, embedding ZK, which is a new feature to add your ZK application or parts of your ZK application into an external app easily, streamlining the existing APIs and hopefully providing a useful feature. It's very new, so there's still ideas to improve this feature and to extend the potential use cases. Right now it's a bit limited, but we are working on it definitely. And yeah, if there are suggestions from your side, they are welcome in this area. Yeah, let's say if we can just get started. First, I would like to talk about the previous approaches that you might have come across, so we don't mix them up with the new approach. For example, prior to ZK9, you could already include ZK in a JSP page using the ZK JSP tag library, which is documented in this link. I'll provide the link later, so don't worry. And also there's a programmatic way to embed into any kind of output stream that produces HTML. It's just a class you call embed ZK, and then it will output some HTML from server side. So this is when you have control over the server side that's rendering the static pages. But today we're talking about client-side approach. If you have a static page at client side and you don't have a server-side component to initialize ZK, you have to somehow initialize your ZK, or you have to load your ZUL file from client side. And that's the new approach. The old approach that was available is also documented here. I just found out about it today. I didn't even know we have this. It was loading an HTML fragment via jQuery. I also don't want to talk about it, but if you find it, don't get confused. It's not the thing. And the new approach will, instead of downloading an HTML fragment, it will request a JavaScript, and then the JavaScript will execute and launch the ZK application. With all the pros and cons, you will have cross-origin problems, security issues, cross-site scripting you need to consider in these cases if you're embedding JavaScript from external servers into your page. But hopefully you have control over your application, and you know what's being embedded. So that's what I'll explain the basic usage today, and a few more sophisticated communication ways of how to communicate in and outside of your application. MVC, MVVM, just outline these few approaches, and then also talk about some cross-origin problems. But this feature is not yet complete, so there's only limited scenario possible yet, but we're planning to improve this. And in the end, if we have some time, I'll also talk about iframe, because if nothing works, you have to embed something with an iframe, and then you have the same cross-origin problems. And there's a simple way using window post message. There's a working example in this code, which I'll provide, so you can later look at this. I'll first talk a bit about my application setup, as always. This time I chose to use Spring Boot. Always do something else, just showing that everything is possible. In this case, Spring Boot was useful because it lets you both output the static files easily and the dynamic ZK files in the same application. But at the same time, I can also serve the HTML files from a directory later using a different port to simulate the cross-origin scenarios. So my embedded app is very, very simple. Normal Spring Boot application, Spring MVC controller. It's just mapping a few pages. So there's nothing new about it. If you already know how the ZK Spring Boot integration works, then there's nothing new. The same thing will also work with, not the same thing, but you can also use normal ZUL files in a normal application, in a normal web application. I said I chose Spring Boot just because it was quick to set up today. So that's then I have, of course, as said, the static pages. This is a folder by Spring Boot to serve static HTML or any other static resources. It's not controlled by ZK. And then I have my web package, which contains the class web resources, and in this case, our Zool files to load dynamic Zool pages. Application properties is empty, so they're just using the default properties of ZK Spring Boot. So nothing to learn here. And in the ZK XML, I just configured a logger that will tell me when a desktop is created in ZK and when it's removed. That's a desktop in ZK, if you don't remember, is always created for each browser tab. And technically, there can also be multiple desktops in the same browser tab, which we can do with this embedding. If we have time, we maybe look also into this if you need multiple entry points in your same page. And of course, the first thing I need to do is enable the embedding. So I have configured the embedding enable true, which will then allow us to request a page with a certain URL parameter, and it will, instead of returning a DOM element, it will return a script that initializes the ZK page. We will look into what this looks like. Then we have our static HTML pages, which will serve as the example of the external application. Now, it could be a static HTML page. It can be a React application, can be an Angular application. Doesn't really matter. Anything that has access to JavaScript and DOM elements can use this embedded feature. So the simplest case is the hello HTML. Already opened this one here. And what we do is we load a script. This is like the bootstrapping script for ZK. The embedded JavaScript is quite small, a few kilobytes, which will just serve as which will provide the API to load JavaScript files. In this case, I just provide a small workaround around styling glitches, because whenever you embed ZK into your page, of course, it will load its style sheets, and the default of ZK will change, for example, also the borders, the paddings and the margins of the body element. And if you don't load this by default, then whenever you load the ZK page, the body paddings will change. So I just load the normalizing CSS file from ZK first, just to avoid this jumping glitch. I can demonstrate what this looks like. And then we have the hello application. I have a script that will load the hello entry point, which we have configured here, which will then forward to our hello page, which is here, the hello Zool file, just to demonstrate the flow. Yeah, and just let's look at it. So I will run the Spring Boot application. Just for the sake of it, I use the latest version of Spring Boot just to see if it still works, and it still works. So Spring Boot 2.2.4 is still possible. Application has been running. It's running with development config on, which will disable all the caches so we can change files without restarting. And now let's look at the hello page. We will load it. It will look like this. So there's the hello page, and it has loaded the ZK page. Oh, we haven't looked into the ZK page yet. So the Zool page, hello Zool, is something like this. There's a window, there's a button, and the button click listener says something. So if this works, then we have a running event listener inside the ZK embedded fragment. So if we type something and we say hello, then it will hello robot. And we see the typical ZK AU request, which is going to the server and request sending the on-click event. So there's nothing new. There's the on-click event and the on-change of the input field, and the response is usually the whatever is updated. So it can be updated updated ZK components, and it can be like here, just a notification. It can also be JavaScript to communicate with the outside. We will look into this in a minute. So yeah, as you see, there's not much going on. We just load our application, And if you had a normal application server, it could be something like hello.zool. I just have the entry points configured with Spring NVC, so they look a bit shorter. Then the other thing is the embedding works via ID. So this is my div. I want to embed the application in, and that's the loading refers to the same ID, to the same DOM element. For example, if I want some kind of, if my ZK application takes a while to load, now I can add some text here, loading. Just add some static text into this div, which will then be replaced by the application. So hello Zool training. I'll just open the browser again. And you see there's loading text while it's loading, and it will then replace with the ZK application. The other thing, if we, for example, disable the script element, I just comment it out. And then we load the page again. You see that that the hello, for example, jumps a little bit to the side and suddenly a scroll bar appears. That's because styles change. And if we preload the styles, oops, if we preload the styles, the style sheet, then this won't happen. I need to compile the file, Control-Shift-9. Let me jump and reload. Yeah, and now it will preload the norm CSS DSP, so the normal styles are there. It's also quite small, 3.6 kilobytes for the norm CSS DSP, and the embedded JS here is 1.1 kilobyte, so really small. And then the, oops, I just moved the window away. And then the bigger parts of ZK, oh, I need to stop the camera, sorry about this, stop video. And the larger chunks of ZK, like the WPD files, are loaded when the embedding is initiated. If you initiate a page, you see that I was loading this this hello string, and ZK will add a parameter, the embedded ID 0, just to indicate with the server that instead of serving an HTML page, it should return a script. And here we see there's a script. It just contains a few commands that initialize ZK. You see the normal AJAX response style, like this JSON object that contains all the components that need to be rendered. And you see all the scripts that need to be loaded that are depending on the page. So it's a different way of rendering a ZK page. If I wanted to access the page directly, I could also do this. Now this is the normal page. It still works without being embedded. So that's a normal ZK page. It contains a full HTML DOM element with the embedded script. And in comparison to the HTML embedded, we see that this is slightly different, but it's the same content. It's just a different way of initializing ZK. Okay, let's go to a more complicated case, or not more complicated. Also simple case is if I need to dynamically add something, not at page loading time, but at any point, I can just implement a button and then load ZK at some point later. So it doesn't need to be initialized at the beginning. It can also happen slightly later. So on demand, what I did here is I have my outside application. The outside application has a button, and the trigger has a click listener, and it will load ZK. What you see here is a small workaround. Right now, when you reload the same application, the remove desktop doesn't work at the moment. So I needed to clean up the current desktop manually. There's a small script I made. I will also share, which we still need ZK 9.00, but in ZK 9.9 it won't, 9.01 or the next version that contains the fix, it won't be necessary anymore. Here it's just removing the desktop manually. So we have hello on demand. And what it does is, we just clear my console, clear all. And if we go back to the browser, now we can, if we I'll just move this a bit to the side. Okay. If we reload the page, initially it will clean up the old desktop, which ZK always does when you reload a page, so this works already. If I load the page, it will generate a desktop with a unique ID. And when I reload the same page, it cleans up the existing desktop and creates a new one. So you can reload the content of this. You can also load a different fragment. So if you have multiple entry points in your ZK application, you can load them one by one. And it's still working. And if I reload the page, it also performs the cleanup. So the remove desktop still works. And yeah, the server-side implementation is the same. You still see it's the same hello page. It's just loaded on demand. So very often you will need to communicate. And now this is a bit more complicated issues. The simple issues, simple cases are covered. Oh, I see there is a question already. Does ZK embedded load will preload all content? I don't fully understand this question. Because I don't know what is all content. I can show you what it's loading, and then you can decide for yourself if this is all the content you are referring to. So if I just use all the requests, I see initially it's not loading everything. It's just loading the embedded script and my util script because I need it, but later we won't need it. And if I load the button, it will load all these WPD files it needs to display the page. It will load the ZK styles, and it will load, of course, the ZK page. And if you're referring to your database, that's your implementation. You can load whatever you want in your event listeners. The ZK doesn't change its behavior itself. It's still a normal ZK composer you will have, so no difference there. Just to see the hello comp, I don't have a hello composer, but with the communication you can see what the composer does. So there's really no preloading. I don't know what preloading means in this case. So there's no preloading. It will just load the stuff it needs on demand. If you want to preload, you can preload. You can add scripts yourself, but it doesn't need to. Okay, let's go to the communication. A bit more complicated example. Just switch to the next page. So again, we have this. We have something loaded on demand. You already see there's a parameter going in. We have a method to call out. So this is our ZK page, a ZK fragment. We want to call out to our outer application, and we want to call into our application. There's two different directions we can go. Both are quite simple. Let's start with the calling in functionality. As we've seen here, I'm loading just another app, and I load my communicate page, which is the communicate Zool. Communicate Zool will load a composer, and it will output a request parameter, for example. And what I have done here is I added the parameter as a path variable. That's something possible in Spring Boot. I was trying to do URL parameters like this in the form like this, but there's a bug, so this doesn't work right now. So at the moment, you have to pass in parameters in the path. You can't use the URL parameters yet, but this is going to be fixed. And in my embedded app, I just configured my parameter as a path variable. It's something Spring MVC offers out of the box. And once you map this parameter, it will be available in your request scope. And that's how I output it in the communicate.zool. I just output the request scope my param. So that's the first way of communicating. You can pass in a parameter from the URL, but you can also pass in data dynamically. So what I do there is just close a few other windows. It's too much for now. Training notes, move to the side. Don't need this one. I need this one. Okay. So in order to call in, I need to Of course, I have a button again. I have a call in button. Now it means send data inside the server from the client application. And when the button gets clicked, I'm locating my component. This is a jQuery extension from ZK. Easy to locate components there. You just use the jQuery path, and inside my ZK application, I'm searching for the component with the ID mywin, which is this ID. And you see the different prefix. This is a $ prefix, which means ZK component ID. The hash prefix means DOM ID of this DOM element, here. And then there's a bit syntax to get the actual widget so that I can fire an event to it. And then I use the standard ZK client-side API to fire an event on call in. I pass in some data and set to server true, and then the server will receive this event. So if I click this button, call in, just clear the cache first. I call in, and I will see that the server received this kind of data. And it's received inside the communication composer. Here you see the on event call in. It will just receive a JSON object in the data, in the event data, and we can just print it out. You can also send just normal strings. You can send numbers. You can send more complex objects. Right now I'm just sending a string. I see a number here. I send a list, so a collection of items. If you put a breakpoint here, we can easily see what this data looks like. Just fire again, call in, and come on, let me get here. So we have the event object. The event contains data, and the data you see contains a string, contains an integer, contains a JSON array. The JSON array contains all the items. You can then you can also use serializers or deserializers like JSON or Jackson to deserialize these objects into POJOs in Java. But the JSON object is just a map of maps of key value pairs. So most easy interface to send data from client side to the server side. So here I'm just posting a normal JavaScript object. So that's communication from client side to server side using the API fire event. There's another event method, zau.send event. It's working in a similar way. So I prefer this one because then I can also handle this event at widget level if I need to. But that's specific. If you have questions, that's another topic, how to use the client-side API. Here we talk about the communication. So we can use the default communication channel to send events and to locate the ZK widgets at client-side from outside the ZK application. A bit more tricky is to send data to the outside. The first thing I do is, for example, when this component is loaded. Yeah. So whenever this window is rendered at client side, I use a client side event listener on bind. I just call a method that I named called from ZK, and I'm passing in the current widget and some text. So it's something we should see in the browser when the page loads and the window is rendering initially. We're still in a breakpoint. Stop the breakpoint, run. So once I'm loading the page, we see that initially the onBind fires, and I can execute some code at JavaScript side. So it's calling this method here in the HTML file. Is calling this method called from ZK. It's just consoling log and outputting some message I passed from the server. If you don't want to fire the event from the Zool file, you can also execute JavaScript from the composer. Now, my favorite way of calling JavaScript, or the very common way, is to call eval JavaScript. I don't like it a lot because you have to do everything yourself. You have to find all the component and widgets ID and escape strings and whatever. So I prefer the AU invoke response. So instead of clients eval JavaScript, I just use clients response and fire an AU invoke object to the client side. Then I pass the function I want to call, and then the parameters, just a variable argument list. So here I fire the current component. It will be transformed into the client-side widget at client-side, so you don't need to do any weird component by ID finding. It will just be there, and there's a message that's being sent. And at client-side, this will be the data I receive here in this place. So that's, for me, a better way. It's maybe not the most shortest syntax, but make yourself a util function, a util method, and just streamline this. But that's the internal way of ZK to call directly, or to use ZK objects at client side more efficiently. Yeah. Then calling out on demand. Yeah, I also have this button here in my Zool file. I have this button, and I want to send some data to the client directly on demand. And in my composer, it will trigger this event listener. Then I will most likely do some data processing, maybe do some kind of financial calculation that you have in your ZK application that you don't want to re-implement at your client side. Maybe you don't want to share the code at client side. So that's a good way to hide code in your application and just provide the results. So I create, again, a JSON object to send something to the client side. I set a message, I set some integer again, and I set a list. So I can also send complex objects from server to client side. And again, I use client's response, AU invoke, and event target in this case is my my button. The button is receiving the event, and I also send some data. And yeah, in the client side, it will be received again from this function, and we should see that the button receives, or the method is called with the button as the parameter, and the complex object containing all my list of objects and my strings and my integers, whatever. So it's normal JavaScript object with the data. So these are two ways: in, out, on demand, initially from Zool file, from server side. Is there any way to minimize the size of the WPD to a lower value? That's already the minified. It's much larger than this. If you look at this, it's 2.3 megabytes. It's already zipped. So it's already zipped by, or let me guess, 80%. So it's already smaller. And there's still ways to reduce this. Then you have to look into configuring your language add-on and configure how the packaging of ZK files happens. So there's a way to reduce this, but if you need the data, it will be loaded later. It will be loaded on demand. But that's what it does right now, so it's quite large. And there are ways to split this into multiple files on demand, I think. But it loads the most common components like the input elements and the windows. So these are, no, the window is loaded separately. You see, windows loaded on demand. And this one is loading, yeah, a few default components like ZK components and input components, I think are loaded by default. Might be wrong, but if you want to minimize, it's already the minimized version or the minified version. Not completely, because I'm loading here non-minified script. So right now I'm running in debug mode. You can just check how much difference it makes. You're right. Forgot if we have the, here. If I disable my debug profile, just use a profile that doesn't exist, and OK, and restart. Just see how much it reduces. So we shouldn't see now we don't see the hint about the development config. Just load again. So in this case now it's only 200 kilobytes. So 50% off. But that's, I think, as small as it gets, unless you split the file even further. I hope this answers your question. So again, I will enable the debug mode because we want readable code. Configure, edit configuration. I want the dev mode. Okay, and reload. So good question. There's always something you can change. Okay, and then we should be back to non-minified code. Yes, okay. So this is communication in MVC if you have a composer. If you use MVVM, that's relevant for some customers. I also want to mention how this is done. In MVVM, you have the client-side binding. Then your Zool file will look like this. You're initializing your view model. You can still use the same client-side event listeners to initialize something, and otherwise you just communicate via commands. And then I just provide calling in is almost the same. You just register an event listener. Where's my call in event listener? Did I forget this? Ah, no, calling in is also different. Sorry. But you could just fire the same events, or you could just do it something like on call in and fire the event in the same way from client side, and just have a command binding. Yeah. But there's a shortcut in MVVM which is called client binding, which we will use here. We just switch to the page. We go to the communication with MVVM, and we have this field where we can add data, and we can call data to the client side, and we can call in from the client side. How much time do we have? Half an hour. Perfect. So let's quickly look into the view model and start with the simple way again. Call in. The call in command you need to declare as a to-server command, because by default the commands are not available, because that's Java code. It shouldn't be directly called from the outside. So most of the events you don't want to expose to the client side. So you should be careful which commands to expose. So I just exposed the call in command, and this is this method. It will just print out to the console the data it received. And then you can do anything with the data you want. That's everything you know already, how your application works. Okay, and we click the call in button, and we see we received from the client side again a JavaScript object. This time I pass in a date, so it will transform a date into a date string. Just the JSON standards, how dates are processed, now how dates are represented in a JSON object, and also some text. So the client side, in order to call in, what we do is we have our call in button. We register an event listener. That's your client side API. If it's here, it's plain JavaScript. So add event listener, and then we fire a command to the server. How we get the binder or get into? Well, right now we just say command call in, provide some data. So far so easy, no problem here. And the binder is initialized from the widget again. That's why, again, it's useful to send the widget directly to the client side. You don't need to find it. I just have my JavaScript function that will call when the client side widget is generated, when it's triggering its onBind function, or its onBind event, sorry. That's the same thing here, onBind, client side binding this. And then I can register the client side binder. So I say zk bind, and then I get my binder object. If someone is not muted, I will disable you. Sorry, Luigi, I'll mute you. Good. Where was I? Here. And once I have my binder object, I can call the command method to send data to the server, or I can register command listeners or callback functions to be called when a command is triggered from the server side. And that's the next thing. So we have a call out function. Again, we will just output the data we receive from the server side in the console. The simple case is, the automatic case is using the notify commands. and declare a to-client command. This is call out. So I can, whenever the command call out is triggered, it will also trigger, it will send to the client side, and it will automatically trigger whenever the out data is notified, is notified. So I have this in the Zool file, I have this, that's the wrong Zool file. In the Zool file, I have these three buttons. The first one is just sending like a normal form submit or a normal submit button in your MVVM application, and I'm using the command submit notify, which will arrive here. It will do nothing. It will just do the notify change to the out data, and out data will then generate a new JSON object and send it to the client. Now you can use any getter here. It's an any notify change, so it's not limited. Just use one alone like this. And then I'm reading the field some data which contains the string I can type in. So if I'm, now come on, give me here. So if I'm typing in something, test, and I say we are notified, we see the client side received some data test. And at the network level, we can see that the on change and on click event is sent to the server, and the server responds with an after command invocation. It's triggering the command call out, and there's the some data object we received from the server side. If we don't want to use the notify commands, we can also trigger the event programmatically. The command. And this is this command handler. In the Zool file, it's just a plain command handler without anything else. And in the view model, what we need is the binder. So we need the server-side binder object, and then we can post a command, give it the name we want to give it, and again, output some data. Here I chose a singleton, a map, can be a JSON object, can be any kind of object. If there's a serializer configured, it can also use POJOs. But here you see I just output the output data. So I just call my getter that will put the data together. So that's a programmatic way of posting a command. And there's a third way I wanted to point out, which is just directly in the Zool file. So if I test from Zool, now we just test the Java approach. If we call from Java, we receive test Java. If we use the Zool approach, we get Zool. So it's many ways of achieving the same thing, just giving you a few options, and you can decide what fits best into your model. Here I'm just providing the out data directly as a command parameter. So the call out is my to client command. I just trigger directly, not programmatically, not via notified, just directly, and I provide the data as a parameter here in the command binding. And then my view model just doesn't implement anything. So it's just a dummy here. If you use notify command, this one is optional, so you don't have to add the command handler at all when using notify command. But in this case, I have everything. So I wanted to show that you can also just provide a dummy for the call out command and provide the data from a Zool file if that's preferred in your application. And the Zool file again will just call the get out data, which will create the which will compose the JSON object. So that's the MVVM case. And now let's go into a few problems that you might receive. Cross origin. Because now we are dealing with external applications, internal applications. There might be cases when you have your JavaScript application running on a cloud server and your CK application is running on your in-house server because you don't want to share the code with someone. You would want to load the JavaScript file externally, and then you will run quickly into cross-origin problems. So that's nothing ZK can help you with. Cross-origin is complicated. You have to read it up. You have to set your cross-origin headers correctly on your server so that it can, so the browser doesn't complain about it. as mentioned initially in this session, this is not yet there in 9.0.0. So right now you have to, even with cross origin, it will still access the same server, and you have to do the forwards at your server. I'll simulate it and then try to illustrate this. So this is like the hello case, and right now it's using for both the embedded JavaScript and this and the page. It's the same origin, localhost 8080, and also the script and all the resources are loaded from the same server. So no problem here. But as soon as this changes, there will be, as soon as the port changes or the protocol changes or the server name changes, it will be a cross-origin problem, and then you have to do something. I will simulate this by just using a small server. Where is my, I have it in my my training notes. Yeah, I will call a small, here, that's my small HTTP server. It's just a default, not default, it's a Node.js based HTTP proxy. You can start configuring your Nginx or HTTP Apache. It's way too complicated for this demonstration purpose. So I just start a server to serve my static resources also on port 9000. Yeah, it's running, and now I can load my HTML file from port 9000, and suddenly things break. Once we have this, you will get, instead of 404s, you will get cross-origin errors. Right now, it's always trying to load the resources from the same host, which is a limitation I don't think we need. But instead of the limitation, you will have cross-origin problems. So the way you can deal with it right now is you have to proxy your requests. So that port 9000 will then redirect to port 8000. That's the second command, to port 8080. 8080. Just paste. And so now the same server will host the files on port 9000, but it will redirect everything it can't find to port 8080. In real life, you would just forward the ZKAU request. Everything that goes to ZKAU or your entry points like this, like the one you can see here, cores. So if we load the page now, we can see that these files are loaded from port 9000, but they are redirected to port, or not redirected, they are forwarded internally to port 8080. So that's something we currently have to configure manually. But as mentioned, as soon as this one is no longer port 9000, you will run into cross-origin problems. Because if scripts are loaded from different resources, the browsers have restrictions about what can run and what it can access and what it is allowed to do. So that's why you have to read on cross-origin if this is a scenario. Right now we have the same host name, only different ports, which is already separate origins. And because we are on the same server, we can easily route or easily forward to a different port on the same server. So that's right now, you need the same server or at least access to the ZK server and do forwarding to it. And then the application can run from 9000 to a server running on 8080. Well, and then stuff still works. And we can see here it's accessing our server, and well, we don't see where it's forwarding, but it's going, everything is going through our HTTP server here. And here you see unhandled requests will be served from 8080. So this is the proxy rule. But yeah, anyway, this kind of HTTP service only something I use for testing. It's quite nice, nice tool. HTTP serve -- help has lots of options. So if you need other things like use different network address, enable something, you can. I would have liked to demonstrate the course headers here, but as said, cross-origin domains we currently don't have, so I can't demonstrate this. I need to be implemented first. To illustrate what needs to be implemented in the response, you see that these ones are still local requests to the ZK resources. And this is where it should be prefixed. It should use the origin server to load the scripts from. And that's what it's currently not doing. It's something that ZK doesn't do by default. It just needs to be added that we can have an external server in this response. So this feature is still missing. Yeah. Okay, only 15 minutes left. It's good. So cross-origin, a way to test using the HTTP server. I think I installed it with npm install HTTP. I think it's HTTP server or serve. It usually complains, but I already have it, HTTP serve. And once you install it, you can call these HTTP serve command. It's just something useful I often use. So now if everything breaks and you need iframes, and you need really cross-origin iframes, then of course there's the same limitations. Iframes that run cross-origins can't access each other. And there's a simple API that I find is most versatile. It's the window post message API. So we just go there for a second. Oh, my server is not running anymore. Just go back to, no, we stay at port 9000 and do this. Okay. And now ZK is running inside an iframe, and this iframe is running on port 8080, which means it's a different origin than port 9000, the outside. So these two frames cannot access each other. So you can't access the DOM nodes inside the frame if you wanted to send messages to ZK. So you need to use there are many ways you can try, but the recommended and the latest feature in browsers is to use the post message API. Quite well supported. Just add the documentation link. Or no, you can read documentation yourself. So there's this post message and on message event on the window object. And the way it can be implemented is there's the iframe HTML. So what I do here is I have an iframe. It will load from port. It will load the iframe ZUL file from port 8080. And there's a button again to send data in. And there's a way to receive data from inside the application. And the post message API looks like this. So if I send data in, I access the content window, which is something I'm still allowed to. So I can get access to the iframe and the content window, which is the window object, and I can call the method post message. If I wanted to try like get element by ID, it wouldn't let me anymore. So, but I post a message and I say what data I want to send or what text, and I send the target origin, because so I don't accidentally send data to the wrong person. It could be that someone is replacing my content in my iframe. If there's a cross-site scripting problem, or someone is intercepting the request and replacing the content of the iframe, I would send maybe sensitive data to the wrong host. So that's here. So only if the iframe is hosted by this origin, it will send the event. Otherwise, the event will be blocked. I can demonstrate this in a second. And in the same way, receiving messages is done via window at event listener and call the receive method. And in here, I can also check what is the origin who sent me the data. I have to check myself. That's part of the API. And only if it's the host I expect, I will process the data and do something. And luckily, this is the same implementation at server side. I also have a JavaScript. I have a send out message. So instead of using the content window, I use the parent frame, and I can post message out. And because I know I want only to be embedded by the local host port 9000, no one else should import me, embed me, so that no other malicious application is embedding my ZK application in an iframe. This one will prevent this, that the data is leaking out. And also if I receive messages, I only want to receive messages from a specific origin, otherwise I'm blocking it. And the same end event listener. And then I can use the ZK's client-side API to call the method to send some data. And also again, client-side JavaScript code can be called from a Zool file using the invoke, the AU invoke command. Okay, so we try this. So we send data in, and we should receive this in our, oops, that was wrong. Show me the debug. I can send data in, so I received data from outer page. I send again, and I see I receive multiple events. I can send data out. I can see that I received a message event from the outside. And if the host is wrong, if the origin is wrong, for example, it's running on a different port. Yeah, it's considered a different origin. I'm trying to send data in. It's blocked because it doesn't match. Trying to send data out. It doesn't let me because I only want to send to 9000, but it's 9001, so the browser prevents me from sending the incorrect data. It's quite a convenient API to send, to communicate in and out of an iframe without adding any hacks. This is just the default recommended implementation. Okay, I think that's it, what I have for today. You see there are a few improvements possible. Maybe you have other commands that need to be improved. Maybe you can try this out and see if you run into other problems. And yeah, I would say thanks for your attention. And I'm open for questions, so ask away. Oh, there's a long question. Okay. Okay, I might answer this. Okay, I think I'll answer this question separately. I don't fully understand it right now. Maybe we talk later. No problem. Any public question? There's something coming. Okay, ZK embed load in defer mode, right? Does it have instant mode? No. There's no defer mode, there's no instant mode. It loads when you call it. And it's just loading a Zool file as any other page request would load a Zool file. There's no defer mode, instant mode. It's not like an include. It's not the include component. Yeah. So no defer mode, no instant mode. Any more question? Another one. Can I use ZK framework in Python? ZK, no, but you can create a Python application that generates HTML that uses JavaScript to communicate and then embeds a ZK application. But ZK itself is based on Java. It's not running on Python. But I wanted to illustrate here that any HTML page can embed ZK. Yeah, it just needs to be a static page. And if this page is generated by Python, then why not? Well, you can embed from Python. How to customize ZK WPD components? Any sample example? Yes, there is a documentation somewhere available. I hope I find it quickly. Sometimes it takes a while to find it because it's rarely used. I think it's in the performance tips. ZK performance tips. Performance tips documentation. Minimize the number of JavaScript files to load. I think that's where you are. That's where you go. And you can somewhere, I hope that's, turn off merging of JavaScript files. So that's the, I just posted documentation. You can read this. I will send it to everyone. So there's a way to enable or disable merging, and then it will load less by default. I don't know exactly what the defaults are. But there is a, or somewhere in the ZK jar or Zul jar, there is the default configuration. Okay, then someone asked ls minus lrt. Does ZK, Luigi, your question, did you just go to the wrong command line maybe? Or is this a question? Otherwise, I can't answer this one. Does ZK Embed have individual add-on price? No, it's part of ZK Max. No additional add-on price. If you have ZK Max library. Okay, next question. How to control ZK session expiration in two browser tabs? Tabs share the same session, but the ZK session has different IDs in these tabs. No, the session has the same ID. Otherwise, it's not shared. And session timeout does not occur at the same time. No, two browser tabs usually share the same session ID, unless you have some kind of browser plugin that that somehow separates a cookie storage between browser tabs. But if you have two separate browser windows open, maybe a Firefox and a Chrome, they will have different session IDs. So only ZKEE. Yes, that should be visible from, wait, just let me open this again. Here you see it's loading from ZK Max embedded JS. Even though this one is quite small, this text, that's currently in this library. Otherwise, you can't download the script. Of course, you can always code this yourself. This JavaScript code is not hidden. You can do all the work yourself, but this is the pre-configured the pre-built functionality from us. So yes, ZKEE, correct. So to answer your initial question, it doesn't have an individual price because it's part of the larger EE package. And if there's, no, I don't think there's, no, it's not a separate add-on, no. Any more questions? I can turn on the video now just to can see me. So I hope it didn't change the audio. Do you still hear me? Sorry. Sometimes, okay. Sometimes changing the video changes the audio. Okay, good. Then I will stop the recording and stop.